Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I hope you're going to go and get yourself a lovely hot cup of cocoa or something very refreshing to drink, because we're going to start with part 3 of our story tonight. So if you haven't heard part 1 and part 2, click on the description, because you really don't want to miss out on the whole story. So let's get started with part 3 of our story. I entered Aunt Eloise's cottage, feeling ever so slightly flustered, but determined to put my unsettling thoughts behind me. If there was anything out in those woods, it was lightly benign and exceedingly harmless. But whatever it was, I couldn't get those yellow eyes out of my head. Something had definitely been watching us from behind the trees, and whatever it was, it had been enormously big, unless the dark shadows had been misleading, and had grossly exaggerated the dense gargantuan bulk that I thought I had seen, which was a distinct possibility. I glanced appreciatively around the interior of the cottage, taking it all in. It was airily spacious, smelling pleasingly of fresh new paint, lavender furniture polish, and leather. The large bay windows overlooked pristine views onto the silvery lake through the trees. My aunt had masterfully transformed Blue Gables into a sumptuous cosy den, with dreamy individualistic furnishings that invited you to be cushioned by both comfort and luxury. There were large sofas, big enough to be beds, gloriously colourful rugs, beautiful, magnificent antiques that created those wholesome, cosy feelings you tend to associate with the whimsical nautical cottages you find in New England. The high ceilings and large stone fireplaces amplified the feeling of both space and serene tranquillity that hugged the cottage on every side in a generous, warm embrace. There was an antique wooden staircase that looked as if it was older than the cottage itself, and it probably was. I noticed that when you climbed up those stairs, no matter how nimble or light you were on your feet, they would make a loud groaning sound, as if the staircase had been overused over the generations. I don't mind admitting that I was flagging like an alpine flower in the valley, at the end of a tiring day spent on the interstate, as an unabashful exhaustion set in for me. I was not alone in my wilted, rather bedraggled state, for we all turned in early that night, eager to develop a friendship with our beds and block the rest of the world out. I had been given a queen-size wrought-iron bed, painted in white, which matched the bedstands. There were white wicker chairs in my bedroom, and a white dresser. The bed was luxuriously covered in a resplendent patchwork quilt, along with colourful linens that my aunt had carefully selected on my behalf. I was told I was sleeping in the bedroom that my mother had stayed in as a little girl, but there was far too much for me to take in, to absorb it all. I was completely shattered, and very hungry for a good night's sleep, and once my head hit the fluffy pillow, I was out like a light. I didn't even bother to unpack any of my stuff. That could all wait until the very next day, when I was feeling a wee bit more energetic. I woke up the following morning to be greeted by the grey face of a very overcast day. My mother had warned me about the weather being dull and grey in this part of the world. The rain poured furiously down the eaves and glass window panes of the cottage, as if it was determined to make the weather as miserable as possible. But despite the obvious assault on all the sunshine, even under the foggy glaze, Maine still looked magnificently prepossessing. It was hard to get depressed by the weather. The next couple of days it persisted in being gloomy, but it made me feel strangely snug, tucked away in a cosy cottage. I entertained little Gracie indoors, making cookies in the kitchen with her, reading her stories, playing games with her, to keep her busily entertained, while my aunt spent hours in her office, working on scripts for a television drama, of which she told me there were over a dozen script writers for the series, working on the same series, which I thought sounded like overkill, but I said nothing. What did I know about television dramas? It was on the third morning when the sun had come out, and the whole lake shimmered under the glaze of the morning sun, that I knew things were decidedly looking up. I could take little Gracie to the beach, and we could play among the silvery rocks and skim flat stones across the water. It would be fun. It was when I was in the kitchen rustling up some breakfast for my Aunt Eloise and little Gracie that I saw an old, very weathered photograph album lying on the kitchen table. It looked so old that the hinges that bound the pages together were falling apart, and there was dust all over the cover of the album. I don't think I was supposed to see this album, for when my aunt entered the kitchen and saw me sifting through the creaking pages, her face dropped. "Where the hell did you get that?" she asked me, her face paling. "I haven't seen that album for many years. I thought it had been thrown out a long time ago. Where on earth did you find it, Shannon? You haven't been snooping, have you?" "It was here on the kitchen table," I explained. My aunt looked at me with a dismissive expression of disbelief on her face, as if she thought I was telling her a big fat porky pie. I had already sifted through the photographs that had been taken here at Blue Gables when my mother and Aunt Eloisa were girls. I had discovered in the photograph albums the very same 4 pictures that my mother had torn up in our kitchen over a year ago. But the pictures in this album were all intact, so I could clearly see the young girl in the photographs that my mother claimed did not exist. "Who is this girl in the picture, Aunt Eloisa?" I asked her, pointing to the photographs. My aunt's face went whiter than white. Her eyes grew round. "It's no one," said my aunt, extracting the album from my hands in haste and slamming it violently shut. Then an extraordinary thing happened that even I can't explain. It left my blood growing cold. When my little cousin Gracie, who'd seen the photographs of the girl that I'd pointed out to my aunt, said, "Those pictures are of Connie. She was here last night in my bedroom talking to me. She always comes to see me. We play dollies together. She's really nice, Mummy." My aunt dropped the photograph album so that it landed on the floor in a heap. "What did you say, Gracie? How do you know who Connie is?" My aunt's eyes stared from me fixedly, from me to Gracie, as if she was looking for any hint or murmur of deception between the two of us, but she saw none. "'Cause she told me her name was Connie," said Gracie, tucking into a Pop-Tart enthusiastically, and chuckling at my aunt's astonished expression. "Mammy, what is wrong with your face? You've gone all crinkly." My aunt was not amused. She looked at Gracie with an indignant expression on her face, and almost shook her little girl. "Don't make up stories, Gracie, that aren't true," she said to her daughter. "It's very bad to lie. I've taught you that, and I don't appreciate when you make up stories." She then looked at me and glared. "I know you're behind this, Shannon, and if you must know, I'm not remotely amused. You told Grace to spout all this nonsense to me, didn't you? I don't want Connie's name mentioned in this house. Do you understand that? And for the record, I don't find these silly little games you're playing remotely funny." "Yes, Aunt Eloisa," I said obsequiously, not being able to comprehend why the mysterious girl in the photograph called Connie had brought my aunt so much distress, as it had done my mother a year before. Who was that girl in the photograph? I was now more curious than ever. My aunt grabbed the photograph album from the floor. She stormed out of the kitchen. I could hear her slamming the door of her office. "Why is Mummy so cross with us?" asked Gracie. "Why is she so upset? Why doesn't she like the picture of Connie in the photograph album? Why doesn't she like Connie?" "How do you know the girl in the photograph is called Connie?" I asked my cousin. "Who told you that was her name?" "She told me her name was Connie. I told you. She visits me at night. We play dollies together." When my cousin told me this, I was completely bewildered and nonplussed. I had definitely heard about young children, round about Gracie's age, between the ages of 1 to 4, seeing beyond the veil. And it would seem that my cousin was talking to a ghost. It was safe to assume that Connie must be dead. I needed to find out more about this mysterious girl. What had happened to her was somehow tangled up with my mother and aunt in a peculiar way. Both women refused to talk about her. It seemed that Connie appeared to be visiting little Gracie at the dead of night. I had never believed in ghosts before, but there was no other explanation as to how little Gracie could know the name of this mysterious girl, if she hadn't encountered her ghost, and if the two had not engaged in some kind of outer-worldly interaction. Even Aunt Eloisa had been completely confounded. There had been no doubt about the befuddled look on her face. She thought I'd been feeding her daughter information about Connie, when I knew nothing about her at all. That was part of the problem. Then there was the matter of the enigmatic photograph album that my aunt claimed she had not seen for many years. How could it miraculously make a reappearance after so long? It certainly had nothing to do with me. Something rather weird was going on, and I needed to get to the bottom of it. "Where does Connie come from?" I asked my cousin Gracie, who was busy playing with her 2 dolls. She looked up at me in bemusement, as if I'd asked a very stupid question. "She's from the lake, silly, over there," she said, pointing out at the water. "She comes out of the lake to see me. I told her that the lake must be very cold, but she says she feels fine." It was on a Friday morning when I woke up to find my aunt busying herself in the kitchen. She was humming away happily to herself, and seemed to be in an unnaturally good mood. I watched her using an ice cream scoop, and dolloping rounds of cookie mix onto trays lined with baking paper. The kitchen was filled with the lingering scent of cinnamon, burnt caramel and raisins. It caused my taste buds to salivate, and my stomach to grumble. My prudently punctilious, overcautious mother was always lecturing me and sounding the alarm about the dangers of sugar and it being as addictive as cocaine. But guess what? I never cared, nor did my father, and I never would. Before long, hundreds of cookies were cooling on cooling racks, and I sneaked a couple behind my aunt's back, as they were too delicious to resist. "You're in a good mood, Aunt Eloisa," I said. "What are you making?" Of course I knew what she was making, but I was making small talk. "Cinnamon raisin cookies," she told me. "I'm in a good mood, Shannon, as it happens, which I suppose makes a change," she said apologetically. "I'm so sorry I snapped at you the other day. I really didn't mean to be so offensive. I'm happy, if you must know, because the producer of the television drama that I'm writing for is so thrilled with my recent script. He describes it as epic. This place really inspires my creativity. I knew moving here to Maine would be a fabulous idea. I think if you're a writer of any kind, it's a prerequisite to live in a magnificently beautiful place, for it inspires one to give of one's best. Now I need you to do me a favour, Shannon, dear." "But of course, anything, Aunt Eloisa." "Well, I need you to walk through those woods there, to go and visit an old friend of the family's. It isn't too far from Camden Village. You'll spot a little wooden house painted in a soft buttercup yellow, surrounded by pretty flower beds of flowers. It's idyllic, it really is. You can't possibly miss it," she told me, drawing a map, and handing me a tin of homemade oatmeal and raisin cookies, with a picture of Buckingham Palace on the front of the tin, which my aunt had brought back from England over 20 years ago. "When I moved back to Blue Gables, she was the one who dropped over here with so many wonderful goodies to welcome me back to Maine. She's a very thoughtful woman, you know. My parents were remarkably good friends with her. I've been meaning to bake her something, as a way of reciprocating my thanks to her for overseeing the maintenance projects for me while I was in San Diego. She also baked us so many lovely dishes when we first moved here over a month ago. She's such a good friend of the family's, and I know she will be utterly delighted to finally meet you. I told her all about you, Shannon. I told her I'd send you over at some point. Believe it or not, Nelly is your mother's godmother, so our friendship with her goes back many years." "I had no idea," I said. "My mother never told me." I grabbed the tin of cookies eagerly from my aunt, glad to be relieved of my babysitting responsibilities for once. Don't get me wrong. Watching over little Gracie was a pleasure and a privilege, but I was looking forward to some time on my own, and meeting my mother's godmother would certainly be fun. I proceeded on my way, following the map my aunt had drawn, which was very straightforward. I was glad it was such a magnificently beautiful day. The weather of late had been so pleasant. The rainy, drab conditions that had first greeted me when I arrived in Maine had taken a sabbatical. The sun was so pleasant, not too hot and not too cold, and its warm prisms of sunny light pierced through the woodland canopy, buttering my shoulders in a congenial warmth that I would have happily basked in all day if given the chance. The birds and the trees were full of musical birdsong. They too appeared to be appreciating the positive turn of events in the weather. The earthen floor smelt damp after all the recent rains. It smelt distinctly of petrichor. And I occasionally passed tree stumps on the ground that were covered in moss, lichen and fungi. I kicked up the leaves from the forest floor as I navigated my way briskly down the trail, but at one point I got the overwhelming sense that I was being followed. I was sure I had heard ponderous, heavy feet shuffling behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks to survey my immediate environment, my eyes carefully skimming through the trees. But even as I did this, I could feel eyes burning onto the back of my skull. But when I turned around, nothing was there. It was then that I recalled the dense, lofty silhouette that peered at me from behind a tree when we'd arrived at Blue Gables on the first day. The bright yellow eyes that burned into the back of my neck, that had left every hair on the back of my neck standing up on edge. I had told myself that in my exhausted state, much like the images we can make out of the clouds, my mind had made up what I'd seen in the dark shadows. Was this my imagination playing tricks on me all over again? It would seem so. Maybe I should be the one writing the scripts to my aunt's television drama. My mind was obviously more creative than I gave it credit for. I continued on my way, unable to shake off the ominous feeling that I was being followed. It was so tangible. It was sending creepy tingles down the back of my spine, and not in a good way. When I abandoned the tall congregation of trees, the feeling of being followed ceased, and I felt an immeasurable amount of relief. I observed on the opposite side of the dirt road, nestled on an open clearing, surrounded by flower beds teeming with hollyhocks, delphiniums, larkspurs and roses, was a beautiful beguiling cottage, surrounded by a neat white wicker fence. The cottage reminded me of something out of a fairy tale. It even had a crooked chimney, which gave it an outer worldly quality, and a round front door made of wood, like one of the cottages you see in The Lord of the Rings. It was very twee. I opened the small gate of the white wicker fence, admiring the tangle of flowers that greeted me, that were being frenziedly pollinated by bees and butterflies that danced happily from one flower to the next. I somewhat reticently knocked on the door, and very soon I heard the shuffle of footsteps and an old woman's light, cheery voice saying, I'm coming. Hold your horses, will you? I'll be there in a second." Nelly was a cheerful woman with a thick sweep of curly white hair that was as white as snow, and she was a very sharp, astute woman with bird-like eyes that were a cornflower blue colour. She told me when she'd been a girl she had red hair, but it had now turned gloriously white. She possessed the porcelain complexion often seen in people with Titian colouring, and it seemed her skin, although old in its years, had weathered very gracefully, and the fine lines around her eyes gave her a wizened quality. Before long I was thoroughly enjoying tea with this woman, along with some of her chocolate shortbread cookies that were absolutely scrummy. "It's so good to see you, my dear. So you are Joe's daughter, are you? How extraordinary! The likeness is quite remarkable, really. I've heard all about you from your Aunt Eloisa, you know. I'm your mother's godmother. I'm sure she's told you that." "I believe you are," I said, taking a warm sip of tea from the dainty porcelain teacup that I'd been given. "So tell me, my dear, how is your mother these days?" "Well, she's always very nervous, you know. My dad says she's highly strung." "Really?" said Nelly, her eyebrows furrowing together. "You do surprise me, my dear. When I knew your mother as a little girl, she was the most easy-going person you could hope to meet.
That girl wore her heart on her sleeve. I knew her as a confident, sassy, opinionated, assertive and headstrong young lady that wasn't afraid of a single thing."
"Really?" I said, raising a brow. "Well, she's not like that any more. These days she's a bag of nerves. She tried to stop me coming here. She told me Maine was full of mosquitoes and ticks that would give me Lyme's disease. She was worried I'd end up drowned in the lake. But I can swim. I'm 13 years old. I'm not a baby."
"How strange," said Nelly. "I am sad to hear your mother has become so overwrought these days. She certainly wasn't like that as a child, let me tell you. She was the life and soul of the party. But then, of course, after her sister died so fortuitously, I guess things were never the same for her. I think she blamed herself for the accident, poor thing. And I imagine blaming yourself over someone's death is invariably going to eat away at you. Of course, after she left Maine, I never saw her again. It was such a dreadful pity. And why your grandparents sold Blue Gables, I honestly don't know. But thankfully it's in the family name again. That's got to be a good thing."
"My mother's sister Eloise is not dead," I said. "Why would you say that she is?" Nelly looked surprised.
"You mean you don't know?" she asked me. "Your mother had a twin sister called Connie. They were non-identical twins. Connie tragically drowned in the lake. It devastated the whole community here. No one likes it when one of their own is drowned, but you know as well as I do that young children and water, well, they don't mix, do they? Goodness gracious me! Over the years, many a young life has been tragically lost in the Great Lakes, despite everyone's very best intentions to avoid that happening. But sometimes things fortuitously occur, and no one is to blame. It is what it is."
"My mother had a twin sister called Connie. I had no idea. She never told me that."
"That's right, my dear. Everyone called her Connie, apart from me, that is. I do so hate shortening names, you know. Her real name was Constance. Such a lovely girl she was, and what a lovely name. But she was not like your mother, if you know what I mean."
"No, what do you actually mean?" I asked, raising a quizzical brow. Nelly's face paled. She looked rather uncomfortable. She was tapping her porcelain teacup disconcertedly.
"I'm not sure I should be telling you all this, my dear. It's not really my place to do so. I mean, if your mother has not told you about the grievous incident, or even about her twin sister, Connie, I've probably already said far too much. It's not my place to interfere, is it? As my old father would always say, let sleeping dogs lie. It's probably for the best. It seems your mother would like to keep it that way. That's probably her approach over things, I dare say. Brushing everything under the carpet, pretending it's not there and it didn't happen. But in my opinion, not that that matters, of course, but it's not desperately healthy, is it?"
"That's why you need to tell me, Nelly. You need to tell me everything," I insisted. "I need to understand why my mother is such a screw-up these days. She's a train wreck. If me and my father can get to the bottom of this enigmatic mystery, maybe we can help her. We've been trying to figure out her problems for years, but she keeps stum all the time. We believe it's connected to a tragic event in her childhood, and I think her twin sister drowning in a lake is likely to be it. I think it makes perfect sense to me."
"Well, when you put it like that, my dear, how can I refuse you such information? You make a very good point there. In my experience, one needs to face one's demons. It sounds to me as if your mother's been running away from hers all her life. And as you say, that is not a good thing. No wonder the poor woman is living on her adrenaline. And I can imagine it's not doing her health any good either.
You were saying that my mother was not like her sister Connie, even though they were twins. How so?
Ah, that's right. How do I put it? Imagine if you have two peas in a pod. One is robustly healthy and very strong, the other a little weak and feeble. When I say weak, I'm not meaning unhealthy, of course. I'm meaning delicate, ethereal, sensitive, more feminine, you could say. In that regard, Connie was the delicate twin. She was like a china doll that could so easily break. In my personal opinion, it was what made her so specially unique. But it seemed your mother and her sister Eloisa would tease her for being so dainty and fairy-like, you know. She was a girly girl, loved to wear lots of pink, terrified about climbing trees and doing brave things that other kids did, if you know what I mean. Let's just say growing up, your Aunt Eloisa and your mother were the quintessential tomboys who liked doing rough-and-tumble things, getting their hands dirty, and embroiled in all kinds of mischief. Connie preferred to stay indoors, baking cookies with her mother, arranging pretty flowers in vases, playing with her dollies, and trying on her mother's lipstick and clothes, if you know what I mean.
What happened? Why did she drown? Do you know the full story?
Nelly dropped her head sadly. It was quite dreadful. It really was, she said soberly. That was a very sad day indeed. One I shall not forget in a hurry. How can you forget something like that? Even in my advancing age. It feels like it only happened yesterday to me sometimes. It would seem while your mother and father were napping in the cottage at Blue Gables, the kids were up to all kinds of shenanigans. You know what kids can be like. Both parents had told them quite categorically that the weather forecast was very grim and that they would not be going out on the water that day in the boat. It would seem your mother, Jo, was less than amused by this revelation. She begged and begged her parents to change their mind, but they refused. Jo got the absurd, intrepid idea that she should go out on the lake on one of the rowing boats herself, while her parents were sound asleep. After all, what they didn't know wouldn't hurt them, and besides it would be a great deal of fun. At that time all the kids had learned to swim, but Connie was a reluctant, very feeble swimmer. She wasn't strong at anything, at the very best of times, and her swimming teacher had insisted that she needed to still be watched in the water very closely and supervised all the time. Connie didn't like going out on the lake in a boat, but she was afraid of toppling over and falling into the water, and was fully aware of her own physical limitations. She wasn't a silly girl, you know. On the day when the tragedy happened, your mother, Jo, artfully persuaded her two siblings to go out on the boat with her, despite the disagreeable weather forecast. She didn't even give that a thought, because children don't, do they? Your Aunt Eloisa was quite a goody two-shoes back in those days, and didn't like to upset the apple cart with her parents. Jo was completely different in that regard. So your Aunt Jo did not want to go out on the boat unsupervised without her parents' permission. And with the weather being so dreadfully overcast, she was less than enthusiastic about the idea, let's just say. In those days, I don't know how to put it exactly, but your mother was the quintessential daredevil, challenging people all the time. She once dared your Aunt Eloisa to eat a bug, which she did. In those days your mother was up to all kinds of mischief. She was quite terrible like that, really. She wanted to go out on the lake, and that was that. And somehow she even masterfully managed to bully Connie to come along for the ride.
No, I'm not coming. I'm not coming. I'm scared. I don't want to come.
You're such a big, big baby, Jo spouted. A great, great big baby, that's what you are. You're scared of everything, aren't you, Connie? I can't believe you're my twin. I'm so brave. You're so pathetic. Look at you. No, I'm not, said Connie insistently. I'm not a baby. Well then, prove that you're not a baby. Come with us on the boat. We're going on the boat without Mum and Dad watching us, and you can't tell anybody what we're up to. But if you don't come with us, I will tell everybody I know that you are the biggest baby in the whole of Maine. I'm not a baby. I'll come with you then on the boat. It would seem that Connie decided to go out on the boat after all, on a very bleak afternoon, when the weather was very grey and foreboding. It didn't look good. She was clutching her doll very tightly in her hands, looking as miserable as the weather itself. But she so desperately wanted to prove to your Aunt Eloisa, and of course to Joe, that she was no baby. I'm not sure what happened out on the water, not all the grisly details, and I'm actually quite glad about that, really. But both Eloisa and your mother were wearing swimsuits, I gather. They took it in turns jumping into the water from the boat and climbing back into the boat. Connie had been wearing her clothes. She sat there so miserably on the boat, watching them very nervously, begging them to row back to shore, for she could see the sky was getting darker and grey, and the weather becoming infinitely more gloomy. And then there were the distant rumbles of thunder. "Why don't you come and swim with us, Connie?" said Joe. "Or are you just a big scaredy cat?" "I'm not a scaredy cat. I haven't got my swimming costume with me, and I don't want to swim in the middle of the lake in this weather," said Connie. "I'm frightened. I'm not a strong swimmer, and I'm not supposed to swim without being supervised by an adult." I'm afraid it was your mother, Joe, who grabbed Connie's doll from her hands, throwing it in the water as a big joke. She taunted her sister. "Your doll is drowning. She's going to die. You're the only one who's going to be able to save her, Connie, so you're going to have to swim now." The thunder boomed, and the bruised sky that was purple in colour darkened significantly. The boat began rocking precariously in the water, as a feisty wind whipped up everything, so it became rather choppy, really. Poor little Connie was so concerned about the whereabouts of her doll. She was a very thoughtful child like that. And even though she was trembling with dreadful fear, she jumped into the water, frantically kicking and splashing, as she tried to retrieve her doll. But her doll began floating further away. As the wind sort of became much more brisk, I think, the water dragged it along a swift, rather hostile current. Worse still, a murky mist rolled over the water. The girls couldn't see where their sister was. Eloise was calling Connie to get back into the boat, because the weather was growing from bad to worse. But Connie did not listen. She wanted to get to her doll. "Come back, Connie! Come back! We've got to go back to shore. Forget about the doll. Get back into the boat. The weather's getting really bad." Both girls, I think, cried out to their sister, "Connie, come back! Connie, come back!" But I'm afraid there was no response to their anguished cries, beyond, of course, the distant squawks of seagulls and the lapping of the water against the boat. Both sisters decided that maybe Connie had swum right back to shore. But when they returned home, they returned to Blue Gables. No, she was nowhere to be seen. So they had to call their parents. "You're joking," I gasped. "Connie drowned." "I'm afraid so, my dear. It's awfully tragic. The body was never recovered, you know. The divers couldn't find a trace of your Aunt Connie anywhere. But her doll was found, floating upside down in the water, further along the lake. The storm was so dreadfully bad that the search for Connie was called off for several days. And when the weather was finally cleared, a team of divers searched the lake, but they could not find Connie anywhere. I believe Connie's body was swept away. The lake is extensively large, you know. A body could be anywhere. I'm afraid her bones were never recovered. And now, all these years later, it's unlikely that they ever will be. I mean, let's face it, what would there be left of her? You never know, it is possible. Stranger things have happened. It was naturally devastating for your grandparents never to recover the body of their daughter, so they could only have a memorial service for her. And they did so in Maine. We all attended, you know. I don't think your mother's side of the family got any closure over Connie's death. But then again, why would they? It was very difficult for them, I imagine. I think it hit your grandparents very hard. They promptly sold Blue Gables, returning to Los Angeles forthwith. They never came back to Maine, until your Aunt Eloisa recently bought Blue Gables. I think the accidental drowning hit your family very hard. I mean, how do you get over something like that? And from what you've told me about your poor mother's condition, she's not the same courageously bold girl she once was. But you must remember, it's particularly hard for her. She did lose a twin, and that's not easy.
I was stunned by what Nelly was telling me. Why do you suppose my mother and her immediate family never talk about this at all?
People react differently to tragedy, you know, said Nelly reflectively. I know, for example, after my father died, if I ever dared broach the subject about him with my mother, she'd immediately shut me down. She would say, "Not now, Nelly. Let's talk about your dad another time." And of course we never did. I think she thought if we shut out my father's memory, it would hurt a lot less. It may have worked for her, but it certainly did not for me. I desperately needed to talk about my father. Your family are a lot like my late mother, I suspect, adopting a very similar philosophy, out of sight, out of mind, so to speak. Think about it for a moment, Shannon. Your mother lost a non-identical twin sister. Your Aunt Eloisa, a sister. And then, of course, your grandparents lost a daughter. And perhaps in their own way they blame themselves for what happened, which is what people tend to do. I know your grandparents were absolutely furious with themselves for not locking the boathouse. And it was your mother, Jo, who threw the doll in the water, so Connie was forced to jump in after it. And then she was naturally swallowed up by the lake in such grim conditions.
No wonder my mother is a complete mess these days, I confided in Nelly. I mean, her anxiety is through the roof. I then proceeded to tell Nelly that little Gracie was receiving visitations from Connie's ghost. She said she recognised the girl in the photograph as Connie, who played with her at night. I think Aunt Eloisa thought I'd found out about Connie and had persuaded her daughter to toy with her. I mean, as if I would do such a spiteful thing. I paused for a brief moment in sober reflection. I never believed in ghosts before, Nelly, but my little niece, she's not making any of this stuff up. I know she's not. I genuinely think she's seeing Connie's ghost. It's freaking me the hell out, let me tell you.
Oh dear, that really is something, isn't it? Said Nelly. You do know little children can often see through the veil. It happens often to kids of Gracie's age. My guess is that if Connie's visiting your niece, then she's not exactly resting in peace at the moment. She's got some unfinished business, I suspect.
You mean 'cause her body was never recovered, and all her bones are still in that gargantuan body of water?
More than likely, said Nelly. The tragedy is her bones are unlikely to ever be recovered. There are hundreds of properties around the lake. A body could be absolutely anywhere.
I thanked Nelly for telling me my mother's family secret that up to now I had no knowledge of, and everything suddenly made perfect sense to me, as if the pieces of an enigmatic jigsaw puzzle had finally come together at long last. Somehow I knew when I came to Maine I would find out the answers, and it seemed I had. My mother inevitably blamed herself for the death of her twin sister Constance. No wonder she'd torn her sister's pictures out of those photographs. It was probably easier to pretend that she'd never had a twin at all. On that inauspicious bodeful day, when misfortune had gravely struck her family so cruelly, my mother wanted to wipe the memories away of her twin sister. She had taunted and teased her twin, persuading her to jump into the water, throwing in her beloved doll to encourage her sister to swim. But the weather had changed, and her sister had vanished in plain sight. Why she had drowned, maybe the family would never know the answer to those questions. Perhaps she was swept away by a wind current, or passed out from exhaustion because she was physically feeble. Maybe her foot had got ensnared by something under the water that had dragged her under. Anything could have happened. As I left Nelly's charmed little cottage, the weather changed quite dramatically, like a truculent, obstinate child whose mood had grown considerably darker. As I walked through the tall, lofty trees, the bird song dissipated. The trees in the woodgrove were swinging like pendulums as a breeze whipped impertinently through their boughs, so their towering figures, cloaked in green needles, swaggered precariously like drunken sailors. The icy tentacles of this cool, windy onslaught brushed against my cheeks, and everything had grown considerably more tenebrific, almost as if someone had turned the dimmer switch down. That was when I knew that I was not alone. Someone was stalking me. Their ponderous feet were behind me. My heart began to flap furiously, like a fish removed from a body of water in a fisherman's hands, that felt completely disorientated by being thrust out of its comfortable environment. Every part of me was telling me to run and not to dare look back. But I did. I turned around briefly to look behind my shoulders. I froze to the spot. Standing there behind me was a humongous humanoid-looking creature, covered in hair, and when I saw him, my knees almost crumbled beneath me. My heart was now furiously beating in my chest so hard, like a loud tennis ball against the wall of a building. That was when I found my eyes locked into the eyes of this creature. I found myself caught up in a hypnotic trance. I remember nothing beyond the staggering moment of encountering that Bigfoot. Hours later it must have been. I found myself standing at the edge of the lake, near the pier on my aunt's property, my eyes skimming on the island across the water. What was I even doing here? I don't even remember how I'd got to the edge of the lake. I looked up towards the island, and I saw a very wet Bigfoot waving at me. What was he doing? He was pointing to a spot between the trees hanging over the edge of the water. "She's here, she's here," came a male voice that boomed into my head. The next thing I knew, I heard Aunt Eloisa tapping me on my shoulders. She sounded belligerent. "Where the hell have you been? I've been looking for you everywhere. I'm worried sick. You've been gone for ages. Nelly was telling me you left her cottage ages ago. Where on earth have you been? Why are you standing at the edge of the lake, looking at the island like that? What on earth is wrong with you?" I looked at my aunt in bemusement. "Over there," I said. "Can you see it? It's a Bigfoot. Can you see it?" "Where are you talking about?" asked my aunt. "Over there, on the island." My aunt followed my gaze, but to my astonishment, the Bigfoot had gone. "There is nothing there," my aunt snapped, sounding very annoyed. "You better come indoors, Shannon. It's getting late. What on earth is the matter with you?" That night when I went to bed, my head was swimming. I couldn't make sense of what had happened to me, as after seeing the Bigfoot, I had slipped into some kind of strange, illusory world, for I had no memory of the rest of the afternoon. Only I found myself at the edge of the lake, staring out at a Bigfoot beckoning to me, the voice speaking to me from beyond the water. "She's here, she's here." Was he talking about Connie's body? I didn't think he could be talking about anything else. If I had any doubts about what had transpired, the next day things got considerably more weird. after I'd experienced an unusually lucid dream the night before, the likes of such I have never experienced before or since. I had been standing at the lake, as I had done in the afternoon. The Bigfoot was beckoning to me again from the island in the water. He was saying, "She's over here, she's over here." And then I physically saw a girl in a white dress. She was holding the Bigfoot's hands. She was looking up at me pleadingly from across the water between the trees on the little island. There was no mistaking in my mind as to who this girl was. I had seen her pictures in the photographs. This was my mother's sister, Constance.
"Tell them I'm over here," she told me. "Tell them to talk about me. Tell your mother it was an accident. All is forgiven. But they mustn't forget me. They must talk about me, or the wound, it'll never, ever heal."
The Bigfoot was looking at me earnestly across the water.
"Tell them she's here. Tell them she's here."
The following morning, when I woke up, I was incredulous, because my bed was full of leaves and dirt. My feet were filthy and covered in scratches and scuff marks. My pajama bottoms were torn and shredded. There were even leaves in my hair, and I had no explanation for any of this, and certainly no memory. But I knew that what had happened was beyond my understanding. So I hurriedly woke up my aunt in the early hours of the morning to tell her from start to finish what had happened to me. My aunt's face went as white as a sheet.
"You know, when I put little Gracie to bed last night, do you know what she told me? She told me that Connie had visited her, and that she told her that I must listen to what you had to say, that it's very important, and then you come out with all of this stuff. Connie is reaching to us from beyond the grave, and she's right. We must continue to talk about her. I will certainly get some divers to search the edge of the island, around the tree that you were pointing to."
By all accounts, everything miraculously changed in our lives after my lucid dream, with a Bigfoot and the ghost of Connie herself. The divers found the scant, rather bedraggled remains of Connie, which the coroner said had been miraculously preserved between some branches of trees that had slowed down the decomposition of the bones, keeping them in remarkably good condition. The body was found in the exact location the Bigfoot had pointed out to me, and when my mother's side of the family learnt about what had transpired, everyone opened up about Connie again, sharing precious memories that had been buried in the past. Everyone healed, most especially my mother, who became a woman I barely recognised anymore, fun-loving, easy-going and carefree, as she had been as a child. We had a proper funeral for my mother's sister in Maine, and after her bones were put to rest, it was as if a heavy weight had been lifted off our lives. One thing I do know is the Bigfoot I encountered was real, but this creature could see beyond the veil, and was helping out a spirit in distress. Connie, reach out to us from beyond the grave. So that was why he was watching me when I returned to Blue Gables. It was me he was tending to reach out to. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, I don't know what to say. That is the most incredible story. I'm sure you all agree with that. Wow. And I can see that, when you have a tragic event that you feel responsible for, you think you're responsible for your sister dying tragically in such a fortuitous event. It's very easy to blame yourself, and it's hardly surprising that this poor woman fell apart. And thankfully, after the body was recovered, the family's secrets all came out, and what an incredible healing they must have had. Until next time, goodbye and good night.